So welcome everybody to the next seminar in our 2020 to 2021 seminar series. I'm Ed Ferrari, I'm the Director of CRESR, the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University. People are just filing in the virtual room, so we'll just wait a few seconds before we commence with the presentations, but it gives me an opportunity just to say a few housekeeping things before we get started. The first thing is if I could just ask everybody that's participating in the event today, and you know, whether audience or presenter, if you could keep your microphones muted, unless you're speaking, of course. That will just cut down on any sound interference and improve the experience for everyone. This seminar is being recorded, so please do feel free to turn off your cameras if you don't want to be visible in that recording, but equally feel free to have your camera switched on if you want to feel more engaged in the room, as it were. As it says on the slide, the focus of today's seminar is on spatial inequalities, deprivation, household income and infrastructure, and we've got two fantastic presentations ahead of us. We've only got a relatively limited amount of time, so I'm not going to speak for very much longer, other than just to introduce the speakers, and also to say that we will be taking questions from the audience, but please use the chat function in Zoom. So there should be a chat button at the bottom of your screen to add your name and also an indication of who you would like to ask the question to. And you may wish to ask the question to both sets of presenters. That's absolutely fine. And I will field those questions after both presentations have been given, so that we'll group the questions together at the end. So first we will be hearing from Jenni Cauvain from Nottingham Trent University. And following Jenni's presentation, we have Brendan Nevin from North Housing Consultancy and a visiting fellow here at CRESR, and Alan Harding, who's at the GMCA in Greater Manchester, as well as Alliance Manchester Business School. So firstly, Jenni Cauvain from Nottingham Trent University.
Thanks very much, Ed. Yeah, it's coming, and it should be there. Can you see that?
Yeah, if we could just switch on to full screen, that might be helpful. That's excellent, thank you.
Excellent. So thank you very much for having me. The presentation you're about to hear is a collaborative effort, and I could not have done this without my good colleagues from the University of Nottingham, where we were at the time of this research, Gavin, Tim and Etienne, who represent a range of different disciplines, including mathematical sciences and geography. So we're a truly interdisciplinary team. This presentation wants to look at what income inequality and segregation mean in UK cities. And the background to this is my own long-term interest in the impact of income inequality on quality of life, on various factors. And you will all recognize these books, because since the financial crash of the 2007-8, income and wealth inequalities kind of shot to fame, and they almost became a household item of debate. And the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, everybody was talking about it and taking it seriously. But I would argue that there was a gap in understanding what income inequality means to cities. Interestingly, in 2018, a systematic review of geographies of income inequality research got published in Regional Studies, and this it demonstrated that my instinct was correct. There has been a lack of interest in urban and neighborhood scales for income inequality research, whereas since the financial crash, there was a substantial increase in national and regional accounts of income inequality research. Not that this has never been done before, it has been done before. And there's a kind of dedicated little group of sociologists and geographers who have looked at income inequality, the Gini in cities and neighborhoods, as well as segregation. So what do we know? We know that cities often break away from their national context, their host nations. Particularly large cities are known to be more unequal than their host nations. Most of the evidence on the relationship between the Gini and income-based segregation comes from the United States, for the very reason that they have better data, because household income is part of the census there. And there's a really good paper from 2011 that shows that income inequality is positively correlated with income-based segregation in American cities. Very recent work in Europe, and the most recent book, which came out this year by Tiit Tammaru and his colleagues, and they've kind of looked at the European context and global context, argues that there is a global trend about income-based segregation in cities. And they argue that a global increase of income inequality is leading to increased income-based segregation almost everywhere. OECD also published a handsome booklet about this back in 2018, and they looked at income-based segregation in cities, and they show that high-income people are the most segregated almost everywhere, followed by the very lowest income people. So segregation follows a U-curve. This is what we know, but this has not been done in the UK before, and it has not been done particularly in small and medium-sized cities, which is the focus of our research. And the big point of departure for me was that I wanted to investigate the segregation of rich people from poor people. Most segregation studies in this country and elsewhere look at the segregation of low-income households or deprivation from the rest. So our design is different. With 3 research questions. We want to understand the relationship between income inequality and segregation in the UK in small cities. We want to understand which group is most segregated in the UK, whether that's high or low income. And we want to also link the Gini coefficient to a story of sustainability. What does the Gini tell us about sustainable neighborhoods and sustainable cities for the future as well? So this is our methods. We calculated the Gini coefficient, the cities and LSOAs. We calculated the index of dissimilarity, and to accompany that, we looked at the interaction index as well, as recommended by Massey and Denton in the seminal paper. We looked at core cities in the UK and core cities plus we looked at regional comparators as well, and we offer a detailed case study of Nottingham because it's where we are and it's the city we understand the best in this kind of more rich context. So this is just the sample. As you can see, the core cities minus Glasgow, because there's no data for Scotland in the data set we used. We added these regional smaller cities with a diverse kind of wealth mix: Derby, Leicester, Cambridge, Winchester, Southampton. We also included all the local authorities in the Nottingham conurbation. So you see them on the map. Rushcliffe, Erewash, Gedling, Ashfield and Broxtowe are also included on their own, as well as Nottingham PUA, the primary urban area, which is the dotted line. It's a bit dense, I apologize, but bear with me. This is the data set in case you're interested. It offers household income in bins, and the bins are 0 to 5,000, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on it goes. There's no historical data, it's just like a one-off data set. In order to analyze the data, we had to do things to it. We had to, for the segregation, we had to separate it out into high and low income. High was 40,000 and above and low was 15 or less. And remember, for the segregation, we're comparing the separation of high income from low income households. In order to calculate the Gini, we had to do a bit more sophisticated things. We had to have a continuous spread, so we fit the data on a uniform distribution. We had to have an upper bound. We set that at £120,000 per annum, which is double what the data set shows. The highest bin in the data is 60,000 per year and above. Various limitations to the study. The data is far from perfect. There's no historic data. But the real barrier for us became about the lack of transparency about high-income households, and it also becomes one of the big conclusions from the study, as you will see later. So moving on quickly to the results. This just shows you the distribution between high, medium, and low household incomes at the LSOS scale. And what I want to highlight from this is that in the vast majority of LSOAs, in 78%, low-income households outnumber high-income households by 20% or more. And I think this challenges our perception of what neighborhoods are like. There are low-income households almost everywhere, and they are, far outnumber high-income households. So this is the results. This is all the cities ranked in descending order of segregation DI. So when you look at the blue bar, that's the DI, that's the segregation. And as that blue bar goes down, 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 if you look at the gray bar, that goes up, 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 up in this little group of cities on the right. And this is kind of contrary to what we expected, because what the literature tells us is that more income inequality leads to more segregation. And what you see here is really the reverse of that. And I wanted to understand, so you see the group of cities there, what is driving this? So we ranked the same cities in order of the share of high, medium, and low income households. And what we found is that it seems that rich cities behave differently. What you're looking at here is the same data. So we did a scatter plot. And in each of these scatter plots, the Gini, the exposure, and index of dissimilarity, the same group of little this little breakaway group is the same wealthy cities that behave differently. On to the Nottingham results. So you're looking at the Nottingham primary urban area, which is like Nottingham City Plus. On the left, you see a map of the impacts of the DI, the dissimilarity index. And on the right, you see a map of the Gini at the LSOA. So all of these little boundaries are the LSOAs within the Nottingham PUA. On the map that looks at the impact scores of the segregation, the blue areas are the wealthy areas, which is where rich people live. And they are more segregated. They have the highest impacts on the overall segregation score of that area. Now, when we mapped the Gini at the same geography at LSOS scale, we were expecting to see the same thing. And we're very surprised to see that that's not the case. What we understood when we interrogated this is that student households really kind of mess the analysis of the Gini, because student households in the model data show a zero income. So the highest Ginis in this data that looks at the whole income distribution highlights the student areas as with the highest Gini, highest income inequality. Once we remove student households from the analysis, what we see is much more similar to the picture of the DI, okay? So the blue areas now are the areas with the highest income inequality, and that is driven by the presence of high income households in those LSOAs. The overall conclusion from this comparison between the DI and the Gini as well is that the Gini is far more responsive, it's more sensitive, it kind of tells us a little bit more, and the DI is a little bit more crude because you're just comparing two groups, essentially. Right, I'm trying to keep to time. We wanted to compare whether Nottingham was similar or different. It's Nottingham anomaly in terms of rich people are the most segregated. So we calculated the impact factor for the DI, also for Manchester, Sheffield, and Cambridge. Unsurprisingly, Manchester and Sheffield show a very similar picture. So the blue LSOAs, and you see those huge rural LSOAs with the Sheffield one, they have the highest impact scores. What surprised us perhaps a little bit was that even in wealthy Cambridge, the blue areas are more segregated. Now they're far more evenly. If you look at the impact scores, they're a lot lower, but they're still higher in the richer parts of Cambridge. So what we found that in our sample, it seems universal that, and we didn't test this for every city, but for this kind of group, that higher income LSOAs are the most segregated. Right, on to conclusions. There's quite a few. So the first conclusion to take away is that there is big bias in data availability. And I think this is very unfair. There's numerous ways to measure low income. There's a number of proxies. There's a number of ways to do this to a very high level of geographical precision. That is not the case for high income. Somehow it's culturally acceptable to hide high incomes in data. So that means that most research on income inequality, including our own, is very likely to underestimate the scale of income inequality. And it seems there's nothing we can do about that. The second conclusion is that high incomes have the biggest impact on both segregation and income inequality, Jenni. Student populations and student neighborhoods were the big exception to that, but once you deal with that, it is the high incomes that have the biggest sort of impact on those. The other conclusion is that affluent cities are different. They really stand out from the rest. Something different is happening with segregation and inequality in high income cities. And I think one way to understand this is that if we use the kind of well-known analogy of pockets of deprivation, we all know in urban studies what pockets of deprivation mean, but we haven't really focused on pockets of affluence. And when we understand the income distribution, if we understand that in urban context, the Gini is higher when there are more high income people. Well, in those cities, higher income people segregate less into pockets of affluence, whereas in poorer cities, they feel the need to self-segregate more into these pockets of affluence. And I think previous urban research has perhaps overlooked the significance of income distributions overall, where there have been studies of what Gini does to segregation. There hasn't really been focused on income distribution, as in, is it a rich city overall or a poor city, etc. Now on to kind of offering meaning, offering some kind of coloring in what Gini means in urban research. Well, a high Gini in an LSOA really means that it's mixed income. It means that there are rich people there. Now, if you get a low Gini, almost everywhere that means homogeneously low income. Low Gini means poor, apart from in 1% of LSOAs that are dominated by high income. So in urban research, I would say that the Gini is very tentatively good news. So if you get high Gini, it means there's a good, healthy mix of incomes. But income inequality using these kind of statistics in urban research does not mean the same thing as it means in national and international studies. And this means because we don't see the high incomes. The Gini and income inequality, the Gini is more indicative of an income mix rather than inequality in the same loaded way as it means in national studies. And this chimes with what Ed Glaser found in 2009 when he looked at American cities, but he looked at wage inequality, which is a slightly different thing to income inequality. And he indicated that high Gini could be indicative of inclusive economy. And I would agree with that. And that kind of goes also with household income. And this is just next steps then, and I'm finished after this slide. This paper is under revision currently, and through this paper, what I want to achieve is I want to advocate for the unevenness of household income in urban studies. I want to find a space and a utility for Gini in urban studies, and I want to advocate for the kind of a whole mix of incomes in research, rather than just the long-standing interest and tradition into focusing on pockets of deprivation and interventions to deal with that deprivation. And one of the kind of good justifications to do that, to kind of broaden out our frame, is the very recent collaboration that came from the universities of Manchester and Liverpool. And they looked at excess deaths in neighbourhoods in the pre-COVID era, and they found that excess deaths in the austerity period were linked to not deprivation. Deprivation did not explain that, but drop in household income explained most excess deaths. So it kind of shows where this can go if we begin to look beyond deprivation and more a holistic way of looking at inequality. So that's me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you after the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Jenni. That's a fantastic presentation, and thank you very much for keeping to time, which will maximise the time for discussion. later. So we'll move swiftly on to Brendan, Nevin and Alan Harding, whose presentation should now be on the screen, and you can read the title for yourself. And I think Alan's going to be talking first and then handing over to Brendan. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ed. Thanks for the invitation to present. We're going to present a much broader big picture story than the one you've just heard, but it shares some similarities with some of the dilemmas of trying to do inequalities and differentials research. I'm going to lead off. Where this piece of work comes from is a promise that Brendan and I made to each other some time ago, having produced some work in this field as part of a Future of Cities Foresight programme, which was run by the Government Office of Science in 2014-15. So there is a paper you can refer to, which was published around that time. What we tried to pose in that work was the overall question of, if we're interested in spatial inequalities in spatial outcomes in relation to policy decisions, how do we get a handle on that? And the context for that really is that, you know, anybody who's looked at the policy debate in the UK over a very long period of now, even going back to the interwar period and the great financial crash of the late 1920s and 1930s, will realise that every national government in the UK has had warm words to say about the need to reduce differentials, particularly between regions, but increasingly also between the cities of the UK. And yet none of them, with the exception of a 30-year period after the Second World War, has seemed to make a particularly big impact on those differences. Those differences have been growing fairly rapidly and fairly year upon year since the mid-1970s. So the method that we proposed was that you really needed to look at three things. One is what we call explicit spatial policy, what government in all of its guises does specifically for or to particular places or parts thereof. But we wanted to range against that the importance of what we call implicit spatial policy. So government does lots of things which affect places differentially, but only in a small number of cases do they actually specifically refer to the outcomes they want to achieve in places. So just giving that an immediate, obvious context, if you look at infrastructure decision making, or you look at research and development expenditure, they tend to be skewed towards particular places rather than evenly distributed across the whole territory. So explicit versus implicit spatial policy, and also the importance of subnational decision making about what places are enabled and empowered to do for themselves. So the sort of tentative hypothesis we put forward there was that it was only when those three come together to maximum effect that we can observe the greatest impact. And we drew attention to a couple of examples in that initial paper: Canary Wharf, the regional centre of Greater Manchester, which I think you can begin to see in some of Jenni's slides as well. Acknowledge all of the limitations of the data that we use, and it's only been since the turn of the century, since that we've had, even at the regional scale, anything like a sort of full breakdown of expenditures. But they do tell a consistent story, which I'll summarise in the next slide, if Brendan can click us onto it. Thank you. So in very broad terms, what we argued up to 2015, looking in particular at the period from the mid-1960s, was that if we look at explicit spatial policies, usually called urban, the impacts were relatively minor because they were often drowned out by the much more important implications of those sets of things we called implicit spatial policy. But if we look at implicit spatial policy, two things emerge powerfully. One is that compared to our own history in that period from the mid-1970s, it's only been recently, and we'll come to this in the later discussion, I'm sure, that we've had anything like the same level of productive investment poured into our places, as it were, compared to earlier periods in our own history. We also suffer by comparison with most of the EU 27 in terms of the level of productive expenditure. What we draw attention to in that paper is that this is not a reflection of party political differences. You can go back to 2003 and see established in pretty obvious terms through the Sustainable Communities Plan, a very different approach to the north and the south of the country that acquired a degree of sophistication in 2007 with the Subnational Review of Economic Development, which we would argue is increasingly pointed us towards a very different set of policy approaches in the broad south of the UK compared to the rest of it. And if we look at implicit policy in that period, it's relatively fair. There's relatively even distribution for stuff like health and social welfare. But if we look at the productive investment, there's been a very significant skew towards London and the south of the country. And we would argue that if you roll that analysis forward, there is some very interesting effects starting to occur post Brexit, post referendum decision, and post COVID. So it's that picture we wanted to try and capture through better data, through a revised approach to the paper. And that gives you a nice segue, I think, into a set of maps, which Brendan is now going to share with you, which start to put some detail against that broad picture.
I'm going to be very quick here because obviously we want to debate. This is economic affairs real expenditure per person. It covers most of the century thus far, and I think it really does show, well, it demonstrates what Alan has just said, really. That's the 2003 Communities Plan, and you can see an acceleration in spending for London immediately after that. The dark line was the north. They started in pretty similar positions, but actually the north slightly declines over time, and basically the southeast and the east have been included on this map because they're the policy on areas that Alan has referred to now. And you can start to see, although the level of need on any index you care to measure is nothing like the north's, you can start to see that towards the 2016, 17, 18 period, they're actually starting to go beyond the spend in the north per head of population. And that's because of a series of very, very large strategies, which are referred to in the conclusions, which have taken nearly 20 years, well, at least 15 years to develop in the southeast of England and around the City of London. Alan referred to productive expenditure vis-a-vis welfare expenditure. The north doesn't fare badly in total expenditure, and this is because, broadly speaking, it's welfare-led. It's about deprivation and poor health and disability. London also gets very high welfare expenditure, so its level of expenditure is much higher than the north's, as is Scotland's, Wales and Northern Ireland. But actually, you can see that the levels are much lower in the more affluent east and southeast, as set out there. So there's definitely a difference in what spend provides for growth, certainly in the south east and east, but obviously deprivation in London too, the north and parts of the Midlands as well, much lower levels of productive investment and higher welfare spending like the north. So these next set of maps are slightly outrageous, which I don't think necessarily helps the debate, but we're going to show you anyway. So since 2017 and 18, the government has been, or various incarnations of the government we've got, have been focused on targeting quite ruthlessly infrastructure and housing expenditure in the southern half of the country. This map here is the 2015 index of multiple deprivation. Dark blue is the worst 10%. You know, the orange and lighter colours are obviously, if you look at the legend, the more affluent. So what I want to show you very quickly is the map of eligibility for social housing, which was devised by high rents. As you can see, the areas which are highlighted, they still have their multiple, the index of multiple deprivation score attached to them, and doesn't include London, this one, because it's devolved, but you can quite clearly see it's the more affluent areas in the east and southeast of the country which have qualified, and virtually, well, very little in the north qualifies for social housing priority. And this is deprivation fund targeting for the 5 infrastructure programs which were set up in 2016-17. And those that are highlighted, again, they have their index multiple deprivation shading on them, are eligible to bid for 80% of the infrastructure resource. The areas which are not shaded are all bidding for 20% that remains. And on there you can see north of Birmingham, absolutely no area of deprivation that qualifies for that, and only, I think it's 5 areas in the Midlands and the north. Oh no, it might be 6. We can count them up anyway. I think these maps will go up on the internet afterwards. Now this is slightly more controversial because deprivation is one thing, and that shows you that targeting definitely wasn't focused on deprivation when these spending targeting measures were recast. But actually it's very interesting, isn't it? The political colouring of this map, where outside of inner London, I think I can only see Bristol and maybe it might be Oxford, which have got a priority there. So if we look at that, and then we look at that, it's pretty much a clear match. Now, one of the issues I suppose we are grappling with currently is MPs are now involved in the allocation of the Levelling Up Fund, which we'll come to in a minute, is that maybe deprivation and other objective, so-called objective criteria for targeting resources maybe doesn't apply so much as political influence and power in the future. That's one for debate, I think. But certainly this is equally highlights, I think, the issue in that respect, in that this is the National Audit Office's database of austerity that was imposed on local authorities up to 2017-18. And there are no good results on this map, let's be clear. But what you can see is that the darkish red, which is the areas with the most severe cuts, have got a pattern to them, and that pattern would be confirmed by my first map, our first map, which we put up, which was deprivation. The higher the deprivation, the worse your spending cuts, and obviously in the east and southeast, the lower the cuts. So what you can see is an acceleration of targeting on advantaged areas, on areas with high growth, on areas with high land values, and areas with high property values as well. And this is justified by the fact that it's more expensive to develop there, but obviously from a historical perspective, what in effect it's targeting areas which have benefited from a shift in the economic model of the UK back in the 1980s, which focused very, very firmly on international finance and the City of London. It's now been extended into the east and the southeast of the country in quite a sophisticated way. It's taken 15 years to get there. What we refer to as ACE World is in fact the ARC, which is Milton Keynes, Oxford, Cambridge, where there's proposals for 1 million homes and 1 million jobs. The C stands for the City of London, and East is the an estuary programme, which is also looking for about 1 million jobs and 1 million new homes. Now, we've many of us seen these strategies before, and they look very enticing, but don't deliver. But this is different. It's now been driven by the National Infrastructure Commission, and the fully funded, well, costed programmes over a 30-year period have been driven into the machinery of government. So the targeting we've just shown you is actually the result of the fact that they have strategies they wish to make work, and they happen to be in a place, one part of the country which is politically controlled by one particular party in the majority and is occupied by already advantaged people. So just running through that, do we expect a levelling up? Well, we think that ACE World, as we've referred to it, is way ahead. You could say, well, what would we want if we were living in the north? And I think it would be, can we have one of those, please? Because it's got the machinery of government behind it. It's got delivery vehicles, five UDCs planned or in place already. It is centralised, highly centralised by central government. It's interesting that devolution for the north has gone hand in hand with a very highly centralised approach outside of London in terms of driving this strategy. We can talk about why that is if we've got time for questions. Levelling up, well, not in any time soon would be our assessment. It's short-term money, it's 3 to 4 years, it's directed at a whole wide range of projects which are projects, not programmes. And what you would say, the more for the North and the Midlands, there's the more significant announcements recently have been the free ports, which are of an enormous scale. And obviously we have the ongoing deregulation of the planning system. And when you put those things together, possibly deregulation is a more important component of a strategy going forward. And that really is a shop window strategy. It's not based around concepts. It's not based around known growth, organic growth that can be developed through agglomerations. It is about putting a shop window up for the world to say, we've got serviced infrastructure, we've got low taxes, we've got flexibility for your footloose investments. Why don't you try the North? Meanwhile, the South has got its very carefully publicly supported, highly subsidised strategy around infrastructure and developed concepts, a completely different set of concepts. So I think I'd finish by saying that in terms of inequality, some of this is quite clear where it's going. But also there is a really important point in placemaking terms, which is the values in the north of England and the North Midlands particularly don't support Section 106 contributions to community benefit. In the south they do because of that historic investment and the model that we developed 40 years ago. But actually on top of that Section 106, they now get massive infrastructure support, which allows for broadband extensions and improvements. It allows for greening, it allows for schools and all sorts of community infrastructure, which means that if you're doing placemaking in the south and the north, you get a fundamentally different product from it. So hopefully I've finished that as fast as I can. Now it's over to discussion.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you to Alan and Brendan there also for keeping to time, and gives us a good chunk of time for discussion. As I said at the outset, if you could pop any questions or an indication that you would like to ask a question into the chat, that would be great. If we can just switch off the screen sharing. Yeah, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see everybody again. So we have a question from Ian Wilson. Ian, would you like to ask your question verbally? I think it's a question for Jenni.
Yeah, can do. Yeah, just thank you for your presentation. I think it chimes with some work which I did, over 10 years ago now, looking at NDC areas, and the fact that when you see inequality, it's generally a sign that there's higher incomes present. It's not a sign that actually it's an area with particularly greater affluence, deprivation, lower incomes. I also agree with the higher incomes thing. You kind of like putting that guesstimate in there, which obviously can skew results a little bit. I think I'm just really interested in the sort of point you kind of alluded to when you started talking about a little bit about like future directions in research in this area. So what outcomes you might want to, or factors associated with income inequality you might want to look at. I think one thing I wondered about was the relationship with mobility, to see whether you're actually likely to get areas which are likely to be changing over time. And I know colleagues at Manchester, when he was in Manchester, I think he obviously went to Sheffield. Oops, hit a wrong button there. Sorry about that. Oops, don't know what I've done. Looked at the relation, looked at mobility in LSOAs, so that try to identify particularly deprived areas, try and classify them into whether it's people moving between deprived areas, whether it's a gentrifying area, and how that might relate to income inequality.
Yeah, thanks for that question. No, yeah, it's I completely agree with all of that. The work by late Brian Robson and colleagues looks at exactly this kind of neighbourhood index. But what the overarching story, of course, from most of that is that poverty sticks to places, and it tends to be true everywhere. And it's high income that is the mobile. You know, they are the mobile people. And directly in answer to your question, if there was the capacity and the money to do more research, personally, I would be really interested in finding out about what this income mix means for sustainability. So I would be like to, you know, I would like to see this. I would like to see qualitative case studies in specific neighborhoods. You know, how does this impact on people's perceptions on social cohesion, for example? And how does social cohesion in a mixed area, because we have a lot of assumption in urban studies about what it means to have a mixed income neighborhood, what's a sustainable neighborhood. We've accepted that as a you know, the sustainable norm. But where I would like to go with this is to look at more in-depth qualitative ethnographic case studies of what these different neighborhoods are like. What does the income mix really mean? And I would like to marry that in interdisciplinary contexts with things like environmental sustainability. What does it mean for our environmental perceptions and behaviors? What does it mean for our economic, you know, outlook in terms of social mobility? But you know, the mobility question, of course, is that, you know, this is a well-established fact that the drivers of segregation is mostly for high-income people. It's their mobility. High-income people can choose where they live. And the segregation on the other end of the U-curve is that the poorest people cannot choose where they live. They can't afford. They're basically driven. You know, those locations tend to be sort of set for them. I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, my own ambition, because there is no historic data, I'd love to do something about gentrification as well, because this would be that the Jenni would be a great way to detect gentrification over time. But we haven't got that historic data. And I think we need to lobby the ONS to produce this model data for a longer time period to allow us to look at that. Because what we are seeing, some colleagues in the UK have looked at what's happening to segregation of poverty, particularly in the main cities, and they have concluded, this is quite recent from last 2 years ago, is that poverty is becoming less segregated over time in UK cities, less focused in those inner cities, to quote again Brian Robson. An interesting question happens if poverty is becoming diluted, what's happening to high incomes? And I would argue that we haven't looked at high incomes. Apparently they're out of bounds, and you know, we're not allowed to look at and interrogate high incomes for some reason in this country. What happens when high incomes become more segregated? That there's some kind of social contract that gets broken, in my view. That's my hypothesis. And high income people can sort of group together and therefore guarantee, you know, we talked about neighborhood-based neighborhood effects on poor people. Well, what about neighborhood effects on high income people, where they kind of club together and kind of reap more benefits from their kind of collective wealth in that area for things like what Brendan just mentioned, because there's more money, there's more tax revenue, there's more resource, there's more social capital. They can secure all sorts of things that kind of unfairly advantage them. So this is why I want to broaden this debate out, to move outside of just the impacts of deprivation and concentrated disadvantage into what does it mean that, you know, we get also concentrated advantage. And we need to kind of move away from individualizing success as well, you know, high income, because I think there are these neighborhood effects that also work in rich areas. And that's the kind of direction I traveled. I'd like to go with this.
Thank you, Jenni. Thanks for the question, Ian. I wondered whether Alan or Brendan wanted to react to any of those issues, because obviously there is a connection also with your own analysis around mobility, as Jenni pointed out. So although it wasn't a question directly for you, I don't know if there is anything you wanted to say, you know, perhaps kind of on that larger scale, north-south migration.
I think each of the cities has got their own history, and you really need to sort of have a look and think about how that works. You know, so like a lot of Manchester's wealth sits outside of the primary urban area, for example, and it might just be worth sort of looking at different places outside of that primary urban area analysis just to do a double check really about whether you've got the right spatial fix on different places. I think the other thing, and this is just an observation from doing housing research as well, is that I remember looking at Cheshire East and West, which is predominantly wealthy, but that same type of income division does occur in wealthy places, and it's sometimes people who have got wealth invested in houses who are pensioners and are actually income poor. So the age profile of the people is quite important when you look at it as well, because they might actually be quite well-to-do if they sold their house, but their pension isn't what it might have been. So I think it's a really complex subject, actually. In some ways, it's easy to look at bigger urban space like we just have and make more definitive comments because it is so complex.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm going to ask a question of both sets of presenters, if I may. And it's really sort of an observation from me about spatial scale, and I think Jenni's presentation sort of pointed to a number of potentially counterintuitive or potentially sort of unexpected outcomes, but you can then, if you sort of think carefully about spatial scale, you begin to see the logic. But it does seem to me that spatial scale is an incredibly important part of the analysis here, but really does complicate the analysis, requires quite a sophisticated treatment. And I was just sort of thinking about the infrastructure stuff that Brendan and Alan talked about, that kind of sort of is disproportionately favoured what you call ACE world, you know, kind of big, mega region, kind of running east to west, I guess, in you know, around London. And of course, infrastructure investment, I think, has become a bit of a leitmotif of the present government, under the rubric of levelling up. Yet your analysis, Brendan and Alan's analysis shows that is very uneven, and there are certain parts of the country, well, 80% of the country, that might be locked out of that investment. But even when it happens, I wonder whether infrastructure investment can also lead to the kinds of outcomes that Jenni observes. So I know Glasgow wasn't part of the analysis, but you know, one of the big criticisms of the infrastructure investment that kind of has been poured into the Glasgow city region over the years is that it's actually helped to further entrench suburbanization and segregation in that city region. So it's a sort of classic Detroit effect, or a classic, you know, when you have these kind of not particularly affluent cities, but you pour infrastructure into them, you might be leveling up on a regional scale, but you're really segregating on a local scale. I just wondered if that sounded plausible, you know, from the analysis of both presenters.
Are you okay, Alan, if I take this one? Yeah, okay. So actually, I think the problem, Ed, isn't in those areas where you've got that mega infrastructure that's connecting urban assets over that vast space. It's actually in areas where there isn't any resource really for brownfield reclamation, for regeneration, for renewal of the older infrastructure, because the only way that you can get development in that context, in that environment, if you're locked out of that ACE world sort of like framework, is by going for the greenfield, because that's got the value where the value isn't there elsewhere in the city. So I think segregation in the north and Glasgow and places like that is becoming much more pronounced, not because of infrastructure spending like it is in the scale it is in the southeast with all that forethought and planning, but it's because it's happening in a resource scarce environment that isn't up to the job. So actually, you know, if you look at the northwest of England, the development is outside of Manchester city centre, is predominantly along the motorway network on the outside of the conurbation and going into South Lancashire around Chorley. It's because it's greenfield, and it's because a lot of it, including Warrington, is owned by the Newtown, the Newtown residuary bodies. So I agree with you, but I think it's not related to how good the Southeast is, because that is a really well thought through integrated programme. It's more to do with everybody else really left out.
Thank you. Jenni, I think you wanted to come in at that point. I don't know whether it was in response or with a question for Alan and Brendan.
It was actually sort of building on that, but I do think, I mean, just to respond to you, Ed, I think this is, you're right, it's very nuanced and complicated narrative to be kind of navigating from national inequality, which is a lot of regional studies work does that. It takes a national inequality, income inequality, and then looks at what happens in cities. But it's a very nuanced picture, and this is why I want to go into the kind of qualitative. Let's bring this some meaning into this through qualitative work. But when I was listening to Alan and Brendan's presentation about the role of public spending, essentially, and I wonder if the big picture is the same, because what sprung to my mind, and it was Jamie Peck, but it was, who else wrote that paper that was the big rebuttal of Richard Florida's creative class thesis that completely smashed it to pieces and showed that long-term government investment into the so-called creative cities over decades was actually the key factor to the success of those places, nothing to do with, you know, trendy neighborhoods. And I wonder if, how I understood you correctly, is that kind of the story that you have as well, or not?
I think it is, Jenni. I think lots of people have had a go at Richard Florida, so successfully, in fact, that he's completely changed his mind about his previous work in the last 5 years in the face of all that criticism. There is a lot of work to suggest that, you know, particularly in the States, many of the things which he highlighted as being a function of the mobility of the creative class was actually about government investment in particular technologies and particular geographies, which ended up producing those characteristics rather than following those characteristics. So it's that place versus, you know, process debate all over again. I think it does apply in the UK for all of the reasons that Brendan and I have argued. The way it touches the politics, which is really what we're trying to get at with developing this work, is, you know, there's a formal flag waving politics of concern around disparities, which is, you know, if we're being as fair as we possibly can, it's very difficult for any major political party not to join in with, whilst at the same time having to make limiting decisions about finite resources and where they get invested. And what we think we see happening in what we're calling ACE world, you can attach other labels to it as well, is the British state in some ways sort of being decoupled from that popular debate about what is appropriate, what is fair, into something much more granular and grimy about what's going to have the biggest payoff. And actually, if we could be honest about the way in which we approach those things, we might have a more intelligent debate rather than some of the sort of, you know, the scattergun, almost pantomime politics that goes on around this stuff. You know, if you look at the most recent, you know, the thing that replaced Theresa May's industrial strategy most recently, I can't remember what they called the paper, but it came after the most recent budget. what you will see there is a fair amount of legitimation of the pepper potting of resources, which Brendan referred to in his slides, which is becoming almost more attenuated. There's more and more of these pepper potted resources, which we would argue are unlikely to have any long-term real, spatial effects, but they will satisfy a particular political audience. Why don't we have a sensible debate about the ways in which what's happening in ACE World is something of a potential precedent for how we look at the potential of more areas of the country. It's exactly what Greater Manchester has been arguing, with more and less impact over a long period of time. It connects to intelligent debates about devolution, subnational autonomy, fairer, sharing of resources, which can grow the cake. I think that's the big picture we're trying to make, and a lot of the stuff you're talking about is, that debate has got us to that point, but we find it very hard to have a sort of, an objective, dispassionate conversation about these things, it seems to us.
Thank you, Jenni and Alan there. There's a question from, and I think this might have to be the final question of the session, but it's a question from Elizabeth Sanderson. Elizabeth, I don't know whether you want to ask it, or I could read it out.
Yeah, you can read it out.
So the question is, I think you said we aren't allowed to look at high incomes. Are you able to say a little bit more about the barriers you faced in trying to research high incomes? For example, have attitudes within academia been a barrier?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to write a paper about that, to be honest with you. I'm dealing with a set of review comments right now that says I should tone down my artificially inflated debate about the inequality of availability of data, because rich people are allowed, we're not allowed to look at the high incomes because of privacy and all the rest. And I'm incensed by that because, well, low incomes are visible in all the data, and there's numerous proxies for it, and we can track them down to geographically very granular scales, but we can't do that for high income. Why? With all the knowledge we know about violent algorithms, predatory algorithms in the data landscape, preying on low-income households, which is exactly what caused the subprime financial crash in the first place in the US subprime mortgage crisis. It's about algorithms of violence against poor people, and we should just, I think, what I want to do with this paper is reset that and say, let's stop poring over the deprivation data and let's try to understand high incomes as well in the mix, please. But that's being met with hostility, with ridicule, inside some forums, academic rooms where I presented this, professors pipe up and say, I don't care what happens to rich people, it's the poor people we need to be looking at. And it's just an ingrained attitude. And that is a really difficult barrier to break. And since I've kind of migrated into sociology, I used to be in urban planning, but I'm sort of currently in sociology, and I've become even more interested in the kind of sociological aspects of this, in how our knowledge is constructed, so that the kind of SDS tradition, what are we allowed to know and what are we not allowed to know? And that it's almost like a separate paper I want to write about this, this kind of queasiness about high incomes and why we're not allowed to look at them, because I think we should, and I think we really ought to do that. Otherwise, we're just rearranging the deck chairs. If we're not looking at income as a whole thing, if we just keep on pouring over the poverty thing, and it's just distasteful, I think. But I've met so much negativity about that. It's kind of deserves to be said.
Thank you for that very honest response, a very important question. We are sadly out of time now. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Jenni, Alan and Brendan for two excellent presentations. It's always seems a bit sterile doing it on Zoom, but you know, if you can, I'll add my singular round of applause, and you can add your digital ones if you want as well. So thank you very much. It just remains for me to say there is one final seminar of our series this academic year, and that will be on the 19th of May. It's at a different time. It's at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we'll be hearing from Rachel Aldred of Westminster University, Jenni Wiles from the charity Living Streets, and Pete Zanzatera, who's an active travel coordinator for the Sheffield City region. And the topic of the seminar will be active travel for healthy and inclusive cities. So I look forward to seeing many of you there on the 19th of May. Thanks very much for attending, and thank you again to the presenters for 2 excellent presentations.
Thank you.